Vue version 3.3 was just released, and with it comes some great new additions. So in this video, we're going to take a look at some of those. One of my favorite new features is an experimental macro called define model. As a disclaimer, if you do want to start using this macro at the time of making this video, you do have to explicitly opt in by updating your vconfig. Or if you don't want to use version 3.3, you can use this with a library called Vue macros. This library has a macro similar to this called define model as well. Now, prior to version 3.3, for a component to support two-way binding with the vModel directive, you needed to declare a prop which by default is model value, and then emit a corresponding event called update:model value. I did create a video not too long ago on what is called writable computer properties, which made this much nicer to work with, but this new macro simplifies this even more. To use this macro, you can create a new variable and set equal to define model. And since we're using TypeScript, we'll also set the type of this to be a string. This macro is going to automatically register the prop and corresponding emit, similar to the writable computer method, but with only one line of code. It'll then return you a ref, which can then be directly mutated within this component. You can also sync this variable up to the vModel directive in the component, and then you'll have two-way binding with one line of code. Now, I know I covered this define model macro quite quickly, so if you are interested in learning a little bit more about this, I did create a separate video, and you can find the link to that video down below in the description. Next is something I've also been waiting a while for, which is destructuring props. Again, this is another experimental feature, so at the time of making this video, you will need to explicitly opt in to take advantage of this. Prior to version 3.3, if you attempted to destructure props like this using TypeScript, then the prop value would not be reactive. So you would either need to define it as a prop variable and then reference this to access the different properties, or you could use a toRefs helper on your props to destructure them. Now, another annoyance with this is if you wanted to set defaults for props. You would need to use an additional helper to wrap the props called with_defaults and then pass it a second object with the default values. Well, now with version 3.3, this has all been simplified. You're not only able to destructure props directly off the define props macro, but you can also set defaults as well when destructuring them. And in my opinion, this approach now feels way more simple and less verbose. Another feature that was added was the ability to import types with define props and define emits. This is going to be very useful, for example, if you wanted to share your props across your components. Inside of a type file, we can define and export a type for some base props. Then in a component, we can import this and set the props to this imported type. If you do have any additional props, you can also extend this to add those as well. And you can still take advantage of destructuring your props and setting default values. And then if we try referencing these props within the component, you'll see that these are all properly typed within the IntelliSense results. The next feature is an update to how you define your emits. Currently, the type parameter for define emits only supports what is called the call signature syntax. Now with version 3.3, this has become less verbose with type literal syntax. The key is going to be the event name, and then the value is an array type specifying the additional arguments that you may want to send along with the emitted event. Now, if you don't prefer this new method of defining your emits, you can still use the call signature syntax as it is still supported in version 3.3. This next and final feature that we're going to cover is probably the most advanced thing that was added to version 3.3, and that is the ability to add generic types with the generic attribute. Generic types are going to be very useful for creating reusable components that can be used in various ways. Let's say, for example, we have a reusable list component that accepts any list of items with the ability to also delete them. First, we're going to want to define the generic attribute with the value of t, and then we can define the prop, which we'll call items, and set the type to t_array. Then in the template, we can just add an unordered list, and then we'll output a list item for each item using a v-for loop, and within each item, we're going to include a delete button, and then a scope slot where we bind out our item. And for the remove item event that we're going to be emitting, we can also use the update method to define the emit and send along the item with the generic type of t to ensure the generic value gets passed. Now, when we use this component, we can essentially pass in any sort of array. Let's say we're using this array that contains a few properties about a user's favorite framework. Inside the template, if we then hover over the scope slot or the event, we'll see that the type is inferred correctly depending on the array we passed it, thanks to the generic type. And if we, for example, remove the framework property, then hover back over the scope slot or the event, it'll now only contain these two properties. Alright, so that's going to wrap it up for this video. Now there was some additional features that were released with this version that I didn't cover in this video. So if you do want to explore those or read up more on the features that I did cover, I'll leave a link to the blog post covering all the updates in version 3.3. If you did enjoy this video, be sure to leave a like on it down below, and be sure to let me know what your favorite new feature from version 3.3 is. Thanks for watching, I'll see you in the next one, take care.